This is about reviving our community. So we wanted the commercial property sector to get a good idea as to what happens in the charity world, and we're trying to link the two groups together. Jerry Skirder is the head of business rates at Gerald Eve. He's been in the industry and respected and spoken for over 40 years. He leads business rates policy at Gerald Eve, advocating for a fairer, sustainable rating system. 20 years, and he's been a former president of the Rating Surveyors Association and chairman of the RICS Rating and Local Taxation Advisory Forum. He's also a fellow of the Institute of Revenues Rating and Valuation, and he speaks at the House of Commons amongst other networking and conference events as well. Please don't shoot the messenger. We're going to tell you our perspectives. Not all of you are going to like them, but they are the reality of what we see as the facts in our sectors and what we think is going to happen. So we may or may not get our guesses right, but please do hear us out, and then hopefully you can make some better decisions based on what we think is going to happen as well. So we've got a ex-chancellor who became a prime minister who is Brown by name, and then 15 years later we've got another ex-chancellor who became a prime minister who is Sunak by name. So there's been 15 years, 4 elections, probably a 5th election is going to come along, and nothing's really going to change when it comes to MT rates. So I guess what I wanted to say is business rates is a flat, easy to collect tax, probably not going to change dramatically for a while. And both political sides have had a chance to make changes, and they haven't done anything too drastic really. This tax has also been moved from collected locally for national government towards collected locally. Some of it is retained locally and some of it's passed to national government. So local governments have taken more of an interest now that when a change happens or the income drops, it hurts them locally, whereas previously it was just something that they collected because they were told to. I'm going to ask Jerry to come up at this point to cover off the history, but not the whole history of business rates, because he said it's been around for a few hundred years.
Yeah, well, you said I had 90 minutes for this lot,
yeah,
so
absolutely.
So that should be right.
Brilliant. So this is Jerry. Thank you.
Thank you, Freddie. Thank you for inviting me along. One minor correction, which may be relevant. I'm no longer head of business rates. I was for many years, but I've passed on to a successor as I move towards, hopefully towards retirement. But my role is now business rates policy lead at Gerald Eve, and that is quite relevant because that means my role is much more focused upon lobbying for change to the rating system, working with owners, occupiers, our clients, but also the trade and industry bodies and the professional bodies to sort of try to lobby governments to influence change. And in many areas, one of which is obviously the MT property rating system. And Shailesh and I, well, we've actually been the collaborators, I think, from the outset when the first guy up there introduced all the changes to MT property rates because quite early on we saw there was a need to work together, and I think that one of our clients was one of your first occupiers of a shop in Boscombe, was it? Or
yes,
number of shops,
absolutely.
I think.
We were in
so
we were in Poole for a while as well.
So we worked together for a while, and yes, seen eye to eye, but actually I think in policy direction what we're lobbying for maybe here on MT rates may not be exactly the same sort of thing. So yeah, don't shoot the messenger, but we'll see how that pans out. But just to give us a quick tour of MT property rate, how did we get to where we are now? And I think obviously it's very interesting to note that actually, as Shelley said, we've had 15 years from when a Labour administration brought in the current MT property rate system that was in 2008, and here we are, and there have been no changes since then. Now you might think that's surprising, considering that everyone is complaining about the system, and I would say that actually, perhaps, and I don't know I don't think this is true, but perhaps the reason for this is that actually MT property rates are regarded by a Conservative administration as actually being inequitable, not really in line with the sort of taxes that Conservative governments would like to raise, because they are very much seen as a tax on failure. They're the only tax in the country where there is actually no receipt coming in against which to pay that tax. Property is vacant, there is no rent coming in, but you've still got to pay service charges and the like, and you've still got to pay MT property rates. So that is seen very much as unfair. It's a bit like being charged income tax when you've been made redundant, or being charged capital gains tax on a loss. So maybe that's the reason why until now, the Conservatives have not brought in changes, although as we'll hear, they are consulting about changes to the empty property rates sort of system. So moving on to the next slide, just a very brief and recent history. There have been a number of property types which have always been exempt from paying empty property rates. Not many buildings are covered by these listed buildings, very small assessments below 2,900 rateable value, empty land, and also I'll talk a bit more about later about next in use for charities and community amateur sports clubs. But the situation until the change which was made in 2008 is that for industrial and warehouse properties there were no empty rates payable. There had been a period prior to that when there were rates payable, but what happened was that owners of vacant industrial property took the roofs off to render them valueless, and therefore they didn't pay any rates because their assessment came out of rating, and government said, well, this is a bit stupid, isn't it? So we shouldn't charge rates on empty factories and warehouses. But for all other property, shops and offices being the main types, obviously, you paid no rates for the first 3 months when they fell vacant. And after that, you paid rates at 50%. But come along to March 2007, we had a significant report from Sir Michael Lyons in Local Government Finance. That was actually preceded by a review of land use planning by Kate Barker, and they actually both identified that actually there were issues with either not charging empty rates on vacant warehouse and industrial, or the rate at which rates were charged after the vacant period, the 50% rate. But nonetheless, I mean, Sir Michael in particular made a very important comment, which I'm just going to read out. He said that a relief for property that is only empty for a short time supports an active property market, as it means that owners do not pay tax while tenants move. It also reduces the incentive for owners to make their properties derelict in order to avoid taxation. But he did, in addition to making that comment, he did highlight the need for a reduced rates relief period after the rates sort of free period came in. Now, the government made changes instantly. The moment Sir Michael Lyons published his report, it was Budget Day, and Gordon Brown announced that from April 2008, the system would change and there would be greater charges made for empty properties. And the rationale that he gave at the time was that this would stop landlords deliberately keeping properties vacant while they were waiting to find an ideal tenant or for the market to continue to increase, and therefore they could charge an additional rent. And he said that this would also increase the supply of properties available in the market and thus reducing rents. Now, I'm not sure that was really ever a valid criticism, but even if there was some validity in April 2007 when we were in a boom and a property market boom, very quickly we fell into recession, and I don't think there was validity in that claim. But nonetheless, he said it was going to raise £1 billion per annum, and so he made significant changes. And these are the ones on the top right of the slide, which is that, I'll come to the 43 days in a moment, but for retail and office properties, that 3-month period free continued, but after that, rates were paid at 100% instead of 50%. For industrial properties, there was 6 months free, and then rates paid at 100% instead of not paying rates at all. And the reference to 43 days is that there is a provision that if you occupy a property for at least 43 days and it then becomes vacant again, you're entitled to a fresh rates-free period, 3 months or 6 months, depending on the property use. Now, this change in 2008 brought about a lot of schemes attempting, some successfully, others not so, to avoid and mitigate liability for empty property rates. There was also perhaps an increase in evasion, which is unlawful. I'm not really going to spend time on that. I don't think we really are spending time on evasion today. It's the various avoidance schemes and the way in which charities can be used ethically and fairly to support property owners who have vacant property. But very quickly going through the sorts of mitigation schemes that were used, the main one I would say is intermittent occupation, taking advantage of this 43-day rule. So one occupies a property for 43 days, one comes out of the property and then gets a fresh 3 or 6 month rate-free period. But it's the nature of the way these properties were occupied that's been the cause of concern and disagreement and dispute, because people have been taking advantage in many cases of the rating rules, whereby occupation of part of a property is seen to be occupation of the whole. So they put a few boxes in a property to store things, and they move them out and they get a fresh rates-free period. Or They use a Bluetooth transmitting device, a little box that sits in the corner of a building, a whole massive big building, one little box sitting there. It transmits a message, so beneficial use is being made of the space. You take that box out after 43 days, you get a fresh rates-free period. Members' voluntary liquidation is another one. If you are in members' voluntary liquidation, you don't pay empty rates. So we had a number of companies being set up and instantly going into members' voluntary liquidation, and the liquidator took an awful long time to actually get around to liquidating the company. So, those companies were set up, ostensibly for the purpose of avoiding empty property rates. They took on a lease of space and ended up paying no rates at all for it. Charities, they have been used, sometimes abused, but used because they are for two reasons. One is a charity in occupation gets 80% mandatory relief from rates, so that obviously reduces the liability for a property, particularly if you're paying 100% as empty rates. But there's also a provision whereby if a charity has a property which is vacant, but when next in use it appears that it's going to be occupied by a charity, then there's 100% relief for that period. So genuine charities have been able to make use of this facility, but we've seen, I think, significant growth in a number of charities being set up for the purpose of assisting landlords to avoid empty property rates. Now, landlords have to make contributions to these charities in order to get them in to occupy their space, but the system was being, I would say, misused. There was a guardian scheme whereby properties that were vacant, guardians were put into the property for residential purposes. They occupied some or all of the property, and they were then charged council tax because it was a residential property rather than non-domestic rates because it was a commercial property. And lastly, very inventively, but no, I wouldn't support it. Agricultural property doesn't pay rates. They're exempt from rates. So we had people who were going into offices, shops, warehouses, and using them for snail farming, and then claiming that that was agricultural. And in some cases, they were successful. Now, many of these schemes and scams have been through the courts. Some have stood the test of time. Others have been found not to be lawful and no longer in play. I realise I'm taking up much too much time. Let's move on to my last slide. And just bring up to speed, there are a couple of the schemes which we might talk about later which are no longer available. Big changes that have occurred and may be on the way. In 2020 and 21, Wales and Scotland have changed the way in which the schemes apply in their countries. What rates are devolved to the devolved administrations, but the 43 days occupation has been moved out to 6 months occupation. So you'd have to occupy for 6 months before you get a fresh rates-free period of 3 months or 6 months. So that really affects the whole equation, the financial equation, as actually whether it's worthwhile bringing a company in order to occupy for that purpose. In Wales, I think it's a mandatory period of 6 months. In Scotland, I think they've got discretion as to how each local authority has discretion as to how to operate it. And well, that may be on the way here. We had a consultation just this last summer, I think it closed in September, from the government on avoidance and evasion and what might be done to tackle those aspects within the rating system, with quite a focus, not exclusively, but quite a focus on the empty property rating system and some of these schemes and scams that are being operated by companies at the moment in order to avoid empty rates. One of the suggestions, one of the proposals, was that maybe that 6-week minimum period of occupation should be moved out. Should it be 3 months? Should it be 6 months? Another was perhaps there should be a limit on the number of times that an individual ratepayer can claim the empty rates, the rates-free period. There were questions around the next in use. Is it right? Should we still have this next in use whereby if you are a charity or a community amateur sports club with property which is vacant and it appears that when next occupied it will be used by a charity or a community amateur sports club, that it should have 100% relief? And an open-ended question as to, what other schemes are people familiar with and have come across that they think ought to be shut down. So that consultation closed in September. I had anticipated we might get an announcement in the autumn statement. Shailesh and I had a chat about that, I think, the day beforehand. No, there was nothing there. We may get it in the spring budget. We may get an announcement in the spring budget. But if so, well, that's the 6th of March. Is that too late for any change to be brought in for the 1st of April 24? I mean, it could come in and be backdated, maybe. But, as we all know, we've got a general election around the corner. So actually, is anything going to change before a general election? And if so, how? I mean, the Labour administration have said they're going to abolish business rates and replace it with something which looks like business rates, but it's called something else. We don't know what their thinking is about that, let alone about empty property rates. So there's a lot up in the air. I'm not sure we're going to see much change in the near future, which therefore means, one needs to look at what are the lawful routes and ethical routes by which those with vacant space can make use of that in a sensible way, and potentially working with the charity sector is obviously one of those opportunities, and maybe the favoured one that might be suitable. So, I sort of said right at the beginning, we're not always on the same page about what we're looking for from the system. I think the government should be reforming empty rates in order to less penalise property owners. They have property owners who have vacant space. They need time, they need money to invest in those properties, to bring them back into use, to repurpose them, to bring them up to environmental standards. And if they are penalised with a significant charge for empty rates, that is going to become less and less likely to happen, and it disincentivises property ownership and property investment through that route. So I think there should be changes which actually make the empty rates regime less penal, and we should go back to a system not dissimilar to the one that we had before 2008. But we can have a chat about that later on if appropriate, and happy to take questions, but you may well want to move on with the agenda and do some questions at the end, so whatever you prefer.
Any questions for Jerry now, or will some of them be answered later?
Just a quick one. Is the agricultural one still in extant, or is it not?
Well, I think in theory it is available, but you're going to get local authorities challenging that, and it may be it's it obviously it smells a bit, that one, doesn't it? So I don't think councils will be all that keen to readily grant relief. It's a local authority decision and discretion. Obviously, they have to interpret the law in which way they think fit. If it is genuinely being used for agricultural purposes, it's quite difficult to resist it. But I think it'll depend on the fact of the case and the attitude of the individual local authority.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Cheers.
There'll be another chance to grill Jerry on his views later on. Right, so next slide, please. So just to quickly summarise on pretty much what Jerry said, you can see a bit of a pattern here where empty rates are getting harder and harder to avoid. The consultation was purely about rates avoidance and evasion. There was no comment in that consultation about what are your ideas to revamp the whole system. So it looks like these sorts of things. This is probably quite a good summary. So already ineffective is the artificial managed insolvency, which Jerry mentioned. The temporary reclassification to agricultural space. We put a question mark on that because some councils will let it ride because it's too hard to fight. Other councils will be like, I'm sorry, you can't have a snail farm in Lincoln's Inn Field. It's not going to go down well. And Camden Council will take you to court and have done successfully. The Guardian programme doesn't work anymore. But I will say one thing, though, and there is one guy from the sector in the room. It is still a good option if it suits the building and you're really worried about things like squatters and frozen pipes. It works well, and we work quite closely with that sector as well sometimes. But you can't really put a Guardian into a shopping centre with a shop and put a shower in there. So it doesn't always suit every building. 6 weeks occupation to reset the clock and get the empty rates relief again. Again, it's been crossed out there because it does not work in Wales or Scotland anymore. The same item is still listed here for England only. So as I say, whilst the building is unoccupied, you can get relief. You can try and make your building a listed building, but nobody really wants to go down that road. It's going to be complicated for your life. Try and get the valuation office to reassess the space to less than 2,900. It does work if you're going to take a space like this and slice it into really, really small rooms. But in the City of London, you have to go really tiny to be able to get it that low. So these are factually accurate, but pretty hard to actually implement these three over here. And again, as I say, you can still do the 6-week, 43-day thing in England, but we don't know for how long. And this is something that I picked up in a conversation with one of Jerry's colleagues originally a few days ago is, well, the best way to not pay empty rates is to make sure it's not empty. So actually cut a deal, which was the whole idea for this incentive. Cut a deal with a retailer, a leisure operator, whoever it is, go down lower on the rent, give them a rent-free period, support them in some other way if you can. And you're going to hear more from Matt later on with his long game ideas, which is that kind of mindset. And I think it's a good one to have. And then, of course, there is the charity sector where we can try and plug the gap, because charities, the biggest problem they face outside money is space. They can either don't have the space to be able to run the project or any other stuff that comes with it. So if we can help the charity sector who get busier during hard times along that journey, then that's kind of the way to go, really. To get to the long game, sometimes you have to go through a bit of short-term pain. So paying the empty rates or planning and all those sorts of complicated things that can take time. So we're going to hear from Will later on, and Himesh as well, on that front. And this kind of brings us back to kind of the options that you have. So just a quick recap. These are the things that are no longer effective. This is what you can do when something is empty. And as Matt has said, get someone in. That's kind of really the best thing you can do, short-term and long-term. So I'm just going to jump to the next slide now. So we're now going to tell you what we think is going to happen. So again, best guesses on our part, based on everything that we've heard, the input from Jess, and all that sort of stuff. So we think the 6 weeks will become 6 months for England. So we'll focus on that in the next few slides, but that's probably the hottest one of them all in terms of what's likely to change. And that's, as Jerry said, if it gets changed at all. There is talk about 3/6 months being reduced to 3. So the industrial guys who get 6 months rates relief, that might be cut back to 3. More power given to councils. Again, I think that's just a natural trend that's going to be progressing. So that's probably one. Putting a 1-year time limit on insolvency and liquidation, so you don't see the Debenhams and the paper chases sitting empty for many, many years after they've closed down. I guess the same goes for Wilcos as well. Remove any reclassifications to the agricultural space. That's because some councils will fight the fight, some won't. They just might make it law, just to say that just doesn't work unless you've got, for example, planning sorted out. Clearer rules from the VOA as to how much of a strip out do you need to do to take something off the rating list. So again, this space will start getting stripped out this weekend. How much they have to do to get out of the list completely, it's a bit of a hard fight. And the VOA is very strong, but they're very much behind as well. So sometimes you will not find out for quite a long time. Tighter checks on qualifying for small business rates relief. That's a bit of a mind blow. If you're interested in understanding more about that, please catch me or Jerry at the end of this conversation. But it's too much detail for now. Time limits on new builds. So sometimes you'll see a brand new block of flats, shops on the ground floor just seem to stay empty, never been occupied. And correct if I'm wrong, Jerry, but they don't pay rates until they first come into occupation, I think is the rule at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, again, another complex area, but councils can serve completion notices, which doesn't force a developer to actually do any works, but it makes an assumption that works will be completed with a certain time limit,
Yeah.
and then empty rates can kick in. So there are rules, but very complex area.
Okay. Oh, my mind is blown already, so we'll move on from that one. And then, of course, this is the one that we're here for, is to try and help you get your head around ethical empty rates mitigation work, and please help the charity sector as well. So I'm going to take you through some of those. Okay, so the current situation, and hopefully you guys are into graphs. If you have a rate bill of 100 grand between day 0 and day 365, you'll pay 100 grand in empty rates. That's the blue line. The more you save, the lower these costs will be. So the gap is what you're interested in if you're a landlord. So currently you have the option of the box shifting thing. So you pay rates for 43 days, and then you'll pay an agent a fee, a small amount of money, to help run the operation of moving things in and out. And then you do it again, pay rates for 43 days, pay a fee, 43 this. And this is the thing that was been referred to as box shifting or Bluetooth device using. So we can show you the next graph. So basically, we've tried to show you what's the difference between these two mechanisms. So the red line is if you work with a stop and the charity sector, you'd be roughly the same over a period of time. Sometimes we're faster in terms of getting rates relief because it starts on day 1. Sometimes there's less admin with us. Sometimes it's the other way around. So all in all, it's about the same at the moment. This big drop here is a lesser known tax break. So if you are a UK tax paying landlord, you'll get a tax break. So this is the interesting thing with the taxman. Although he's penalising landlords for empty buildings, and Jerry is totally spot on, there are other tax breaks that are there and exist to help the charity sector. So one of them is, if you donate space to a charity for a year, they will give you a certificate. The charity can give you a certificate saying, thank you for the space. I know you could have charged me, say for this floor, £150,000 in rent over the course of a year, but you've charged us nothing. Here's a bit of paper saying thank you very much. You can take that piece of paper, put it on your tax return at the end of the year, and reduce your taxable profits by 150 grand. So although you haven't handed any money over, you're getting a big tax deduction. So you take the tax rate times 150 grand, that's about £35,000 of hard money in your pocket. This is on top of the business rate saving. So when we talk to an accountant who brings this angle in and introduces that to the property sector, that, as I say, is when magic happens. And that's why you'll see the costs drop off dramatically at day 366. You don't have to commit to that front. It doesn't work for pension schemes and REITs because they don't pay tax. But if there is a UK tax-paying landlord, this is a very less known benefit that's out there for you. Can I have the next slide, please? So if England copies Wales and Scotland and moves the 6 weeks to 6 months, you'll have to pay rates for 6 months, 183 days. So that's about 50 grand out of the 100 you have to pay. And then you'll get your 3 months rates relief, and then you'll do it again. So the next graph will show you that this is not as good as it used to be. So the box shifting model is basically broken in Wales and Scotland. So people don't do that anymore, generally speaking, out there. So the gap between the blue line and the red line is much more viable, basically, in this situation. So again, everything else stays the same. Is everyone okay with that? Do they get it? Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, next slide. Right, this is where we're going to bring in a couple of other people as well. So we've talked about money quite a lot. There are additional benefits. So the money we've talked about, that's great. The 2 tax breaks, we've mentioned one already. Will's going to bring in another one in a little while. Insurance, lights on, and charities become a rent-paying tenant. So I'm going to cover off some of these quickly, and I'll introduce Himesh probably next. Charities have gone on to become rent-paying tenants. This is very much like with Matt's experience with tenants in Poole who have gone on and said, okay, you know, we've made this work over 2 years. We now can afford to pay a rent and rates and be here in the long term. Some of the charities we've helped, for example, in Birmingham, we've got half of a 17-story office block, which would have become a hotel, but COVID hit. And so the landlords changed their mind. And although people like Yellow Pages or Yell have moved out and Regis has moved out, they are basically bringing office organisations back. So in the meantime, we've put in about 6 or 7 different charities. Everyone from Mind that wanted a base in the city centre, and a whole bunch of other lesser-known names as well. Some have now been embedded in the community so well and so strongly, they've been able to attract grant funding to become proper rent-paying tenants. So at that point, whether it's Birmingham, Bishop Auckland, West 12 Shopping Centre a long, long time ago, those charities have become rent-paying tenants, which has probably flipped the profitability of those centres to the degree of about £250,000. So again, it's a bit like what Matt does. If you give someone a bit of a chance to embed themselves and prove their worth, they will deliver value to you. So that could be a charity, it could be another social enterprise, or just a normal corporate as well. Benefits of lights on, there's more people that will come to your shop and therefore shop at the other shops as well. And with the lights on, your shop might become more viable as a potential tenant. So we used to do a free bookshop in Eastleigh, and it was so popular that a Cafe Nero came along and took the space off us. So we kind of became a victim of our own success. But that's a good thing because we bought that viability and noticeability as well.